The international draft is going to kill baseball in the DR, or will it? Baseball in Latin America is the wild, wild west. And no, I'm not talking about some John Wayne, Cowboys vs. Aliens, Hollywood Great Frontier bullshit. I'm talking about the real Wild West, or Caribbean, I guess. Now we all know what goes down there in Latin America. I mean, come on, guys. We all know. We know that they're dirty, smelly, corrupt third world nations, and we know this because the American mainstream media tells us they're dirty, smelly, corrupt third world. Oh, I see.
Don't believe everything you hear, son.
But in all seriousness, extensive reporting on this topic throughout the years has made one thing very clear. It is time for a change in Latin America and Major League Baseball. And it seems that both the league and the Players Union agree on this. Now, how to precisely go about these changes? That's where things differ. From ID falsification to bonus skimming to amateur steroid use to human trafficking and pretty much downright negligence on everybody's part, there have been no shortage of scandals to come out of the region. Now, take a look at a few of these scandals that I think are important. There's so many of them. I mean, this project took me literally dozens of hours of research and 100 pages worth of notes. In caveat, we're only going to focus on Latin America, and more specifically the Dominican Republic, since when people think of the international draft, that's where they think of. And most opposition to the draft has been primarily from Latino ball players. But before we begin today's video, don't forget to subscribe. When an amateur signs through the Rule 4 draft in the United States, the negotiations center around the player, the agent he hires, and the team that drafted him. In the Dominican Republic, things are a little different. Through the Buscón system, which is a loose plane on the words buscar, or to find, the Dominican scout / trainer / agent, known as a Buscón, scouts for players as young as 10 years old. And out of the goodness of his big, warm heart, he trains them, houses them, clothes them, and feeds them all for free.
I love home.
Until they're 16 years old, and then he can auction off the player to the highest bidding team, taking a very hefty cut from that signing bonus.
All of this, and then when it goes, you sell it.
Some sources say usually 30%, others say as high as 50%, but suffice to say they do pretty well for themselves. As a former Colorado Rockies executive named Dick tells it, instead of signing 4 guys at $25,000 each, you sign 20 Dominican guys for $5,000 each. Which of course is very sound economics, but it does kind of fuel a system where the Buscones corner the market. An MLB team can only tap into this oil well through the middleman that is the Buscón, who of course is making bank because he's selling players at a premium price and he's selling a lot of them. Of course, the kids have pretty much no say in any of this. It's a catch-22 system where the ones who represent them, the Buscones, are also the ones set to financially benefit from them the most. It may be scummy, but if you're a parent and a kid who's bought into this illusion that the only way out of poverty is through this system and through baseball, what other choices do you have?
¿Quién aquí tiene el sueño de entrar a la Grande Liga? A todos.
To be fair though, there do seem to be some Buscones who certainly care about their players and go above and beyond to make sure that they're not only solid ball players, but solid people as well. But then there are the others.
Eso es una mafia.
At the end of 2016, MLB and the MLB EPA agreed to a new collective bargaining agreement covering the 2017 to 2021 seasons. So this new 2017 CBA established hardcore limits on what a team could spend, and they couldn't go over it, they were not allowed to. Some, such as Ken Rosenthal and María Torres in The Athletic, argue that this actually accelerated corruption in the Dominican Republic. For example, teams have gotten pretty good at estimating the amount of money they'll have available up to like 5 years in advance. So to give themselves cost certainty, they want to lock up as many people as they can right now. Of course, if you're going to be 16 years old in 5 years, that means that right now you're 11 years old. Math. So nowadays, it's more common for kids to quote-unquote sign at much younger ages than ever before. Of course, they're not actually signing 10-year-old kids to a written agreement. No, come on, that would be illegal. That's a big no-no.
Wait, that's illegal.
What happens is that the kid and his representative, the Buscón, come to a verbal agreement with an MLB team. And so when the kid is 16 years old, the team agrees to legally sign him then. If you're Buscón, this works out nice for you because you have just pretty much guaranteed yourself a nice little paycheck a few years down the road. And if you're a young, wide-eyed Dominican kid who's only like 12 or 13 years old, I mean, who wouldn't take that deal? Especially if it comes from a big, prestigious American ball club. Yeah! Of course, the deals aren't official, MLB themselves say that these agreements are unenforceable, so you can imagine the kind of problems that arise from this. As the deceased Rudy Santin, longtime MLB scout and Dominican Buscon, tells Christian Red and Terry Thompson of USA Today. Teams don't always honor these handshake deals because, to put it simply, they just don't have to. According to a former Braves scout, many times they will sign a player for as much as 50% less than they verbally agreed to, or they might not even sign the player at all. Now, you might think, so what?
What's your point?
There's 29 other ball clubs, right? Well, here's the thing. During the kid's formative years, the team basically hides him away in their academy so no other team can see him, and more importantly, scout him. So if the team doesn't sign the player like they verbally agreed to, then that player's at a total disadvantage because no one's ever seen of or heard of him.
The hell are you supposed to be?
Which dramatically drives down his market value. Since teams keep signing players at younger and younger ages, some Buscones take advantage of this market opportunity by selling players with more physically mature bodies.
It's called the exercise.
Now this has become such a thing that the freaking FBI got involved, reportedly instructing Rudy Santin to record conversations he had with MLB team officials. By the way, did I mention that Rudy Santin is now dead? Santin, when he was alive, reportedly would tell Major League Baseball and the Players Association about blatant corruption going on in the DR, going so far as to giving actual names of these bad hombres. But according to Rudy, the only response he ever got was TFTI. And this is important to note, because remember, it takes two to tango, and Major League Baseball is no angel. In the book Stealing Lives, Arturo J. Marcano Guevara and David P. Fittler give two theories when investigating Latin American exploitation: the disbelief syndrome and the opportunity thesis. The disbelief syndrome is self-explanatory. It means people in MLB just don't believe that kids are being exploited.
Impossible.
The opportunity thesis, on the other hand, acknowledges the corruption and exploitation that exists, but justifies it as a means to an end.
Whatever it takes.
After all, as Steve Fineru of the WAPO noted, Major League officials point out that teams provide opportunities to deeply impoverished athletes who might otherwise have none. And legendary baseball scout René Gallo, more on him later, poetically describes that if it weren't for baseball, these kids would end up selling mangoes in the street for the equivalent of a quarter. So to save these poor kids from selling mangoes, sometimes these clubs have to make some tough decisions. For example, in the USA Today article, Santin explicitly implicates Chris Kemp, international scouting director for the San Diego Padres, as someone who engages in the premature handshake deals.
Bruh.
Okay, so the Padres follow the rules, and we know that. But what about the Atlanta Braves, who in 2017 MLB discovered had been making fraudulent international signings for 3 seasons? Atlanta lost 13 prospects. They also lost the 13-year-old Robert Balson, whom they had a handshake deal with. The Braves weren't allowed to sign an international prospect for more than $10,000 until 2021. MLB suspended Special Assistant Gordon Blakely for a year, and to show just how elaborate and corrupt this complex system gets, MLB banned Atlanta Braves general manager John Coppola for life. To be honest, what the Braves did wasn't anything super egregious. At least within the context that pretty much every MLB team has at one point engaged in some, if not all, of these acts. But I think the Braves got penalized because they did all of this, and they did it so brazenly. Coppola basically laughed in Major League Baseball's face because he was pretty certain he could get away with it, and you know what? For more than 2 years, he actually did.
I won.
To show you a couple of other examples, in 2010, Big Brother charged 3 White Sox employees led by Senior Director of Player Personnel, David Wilder, with mail fraud for accepting $400,000 in kickbacks.
Greed is good.
In fact, in order to deflect from his own criminal activities, Wilder tipped the feds about Jim Bowden's and Jose Rijo's own little schemes within the Nats organization, which just goes to show you just how cutthroat this industry is. Now, I'm sure you've heard of Jim Bowden, now a world-famous baseball savant for the Athletic. The FBI investigated him regarding the 2006 signing of 16-year-old prospect Esmalin Gonzalez, who actually turned out to be 20-year-old Carlos Daniel Alvarez Lugo. Stan Kasten, then Nats president, described Jim Bowden as resourceful. Of course, Stan Kasten is now president of the Los Angeles Dodgers. And in 2018, Sports Illustrated reported that the Department of Justice had a trove of evidence on Major League Baseball and its teams, particularly the Dodgers. According to SI, the Dodgers front office had first-hand knowledge about some very bad hombres on their payroll. It got so bad that they created a 1 through 5 chart to monitor egregious behavior, with 1 meaning innocent bystander and 5 being a straight-up criminal. And no, I did not make this chart. The Los Angeles Dodgers, arguably the smartest, most analytical team in all of baseball, literally drew up a kindergarten chart from the numbers 1 through 5 to determine if their own employees needed a timeout.
Thanks for the tip.
The Department of Justice became interested in Major League Baseball initially due to all the human smuggling that occurs out of Cuba. Major League teams were accused of not only knowing about this, but also actually being actively involved at some point during the process. In 2018, Eddie Dominguez, a former official investigator for Major League Baseball and ex-law enforcement, released a tantalizing book titled Baseball Cop. In the book, among other things, he notes that MLB's only concern is whether a Cuban player's residency is legal or not. But MLB doesn't bother with the conditions the player faced as he tried to get into the United States, whether his passport was falsified, or how he had gone about getting his residency. In other words, MLB knows everything going on in regards to Cuban smuggling and ID falsification, but it's set up its own rules to essentially exonerate itself from a legal standpoint, as long as they stick to their don't ask, don't tell policy. As a former federal prosecutor admits, everybody in the world knows this is going on, but apparently nobody cares. You remember Rene Gallo, right? That legendary scout who thinks Dominican kids are only good for baseball and selling mangoes. Well, Rene Gallo is so legendary that he once starred in a documentary called Pelotero with Sid the Sloth. True story. The documentary follows 2 Dominican prospects in 2009. One of them, a 16-year-old future Twins All-Star, Miguel Sano. In the documentary, it's implied that Rene Gallo spread rumors that Sano was actually older than 16 years old, which obviously would drive down his market price. Of course, this would benefit Gallo because he and the Pirates really wanted Sano. But why pay $6 million for a player when, for example, you can get him for, say, $2 million? Which is exactly what Gallo offered Sano when MLB started investigating his age. So the guy who allegedly started the rumors then is the one to magically appear at the last minute as the benevolent American savior by offering a third of Sano's initial market value. I implore you to please watch this documentary. It's available for free on Tubi. It is a great insight into Dominican baseball, greed, corruption, and the downright brainwashing of teenage minds. As for Rene Gallo, The Athletic reports that in 2017 the Pirates failed to renew his contract after he took improper payments from a Mexican summer league team. But Gallo is simply just one pawn in this very elaborate, very corrupt mechanism that is Major League Baseball in Latin America. In the Alvarez case, Sam Kasten admitted that there were many others involved with his age fraud, as no teenager could execute this elaborate plan. In Baseball Cop, Dominguez admits that these schemes of absolute corruption involved an absurd amount of people, including air scouts, assistant GMs, academy administrators, local agents, trainers, doctors, priests, government officials, bankers, and parents, all involved in altering players' age and identities, skimming money from player bonuses and even U.S. tax returns, and forcefully injecting PEDs into Dominican kids. And of course, we've seen how MLB turns a blind eye towards Cuban smuggling, and their perilous journeys in spite of human traffickers, archaic laws, and Mother Nature have been well documented. However, did you know that in a desperate attempt to flee Cuba and make millions of dollars in the United States, some ball players have accused fellow Cuban citizens of trying to defect or smuggle them out, all to distract the Cuban government from their own defection? Did you also know that Major League Baseball once let a convicted child molester slip through their showcase system? So see, I don't know about you, but if I had a multi-billion-dollar business, I would try to disassociate myself from people who could potentially tear the whole damn thing down, and most importantly, shrink my wallet.
Es el businessman. Qué bien, qué bien.
And I definitely don't think I'd create living conditions such as those detailed in Stealing Lives. This book follows a 17-year-old nobody named Alexis Quiros at a Cubs baseball academy back in the 90s. The conditions described were so horrid that the players nicknamed the academy Vietnam due to the oppressive heat, lack of water, no electricity, bad food. And by the way, the house had only one toilet, sans running water, used by 19 teenage boys. And speaking of toilets, back in 2003, one plucky executive vice president for labor relations and human resources by the name of Robbie D. Manfred was asked about the lack of a drug testing program in Latin America, which of course back then was a whole nother thing since MLB didn't really pay attention to steroid use within its own league, in its own country. Why would it do so for amateurs in a foreign country? So to this, Manfred responded, "We don't want to flush a lot of money down the toilet." Wait a minute. Isn't this the same person that desperately wants an international draft? The same person who recently said,
I'm the same person today as I was in 1998.
Interesting. Well, in that same article, where you can find the Robbie quote, the WAPO reports that 2 unsigned players died in 2001 after injecting animal drugs, which are PEDs used in animals. So what, right? I mean, it's not like all kids are dying because of MLB's negligence in Latin America, right? In 2009, a 16-year-old Dominican kid by the name of Yuri Guillen signed with the Washington Nationals. However, MLB would quickly suspend Yuri for alleged age fraud, but this wouldn't deter Yuri. He wanted to play so bad that he kept showing up to the Nats Academy without pay to train. Meanwhile, it took MLB until 2011, almost 2 years later, to finally authorize Yuri to play without finding a single shred of evidence of age fraud. So Yuri faced a little setback. That didn't matter anymore. Now he was about to live his dreams as a professional baseball player, scheduled to leave for the United States on April 15th. On April 1st, while training at the academy, Yuri began experiencing some headaches. On April 8th, a heavy fever. On April 15th, 2011, Yuri was pronounced dead due to bacterial meningitis. The traditional media outlets reported that the Washington Nationals had followed protocol. However, Ian Gordon and Weather Jones paints a different picture. According to his findings, the Nationals had in fact sent Yuri home when he contracted the fever. His family took him to their hometown clinic, described as somewhat rural and 45 minutes away from the capital, Santo Domingo. Yuri's Buscón urged them to take him to Clínica Abreu, described as the best private hospital in Santo Domingo. However, the admission fee was $1,300, which the family couldn't afford to pay. And Yuri didn't have health insurance because his contract was still being finalized. So no one from the Nationals Academy accompanied Yuri to get a medical evaluation. Of course, there was no athletic trainer, let alone a doctor on site because the Nats weren't required to have one. The Nationals did cover Yuri's treatment costs once he was admitted into his hometown clinic, not the Santo Domingo hospital as the WAPO misreports. But by then, of course, it was all too late. The Nationals made it up to Yuri's parents by giving them his signing bonus and life insurance money, in exchange for a few things. According to Yuri's uncle, as a condition of receiving Yuri's money, his parents had to agree that Yuri got infected outside of the Nats facility, and that was what led to the bacterial meningitis. To this day, no one knows for sure when and how Yuri got infected. This affirmation by the Nats contradicts MLB's official investigation, which states that Yuri died due to a sinus infection, not bacterial meningitis. The parents also had to agree that the team gave Yuri proper treatment, which, if Gordon's account is accurate, was a straight-up lie, as all they gave Yuri was a tea and an aspirin. But hey, maybe that is proper treatment, I don't know, I'm not a doctor. And obviously the parents agreed never to sue the Nationals or any of their employees. For the Nats, there was no punishment, because technically, if we're being honest, the Washington Nationals didn't break any rules. They were just adhering to the policies already in place. Hell, they were even so nice that they paid for Yuri's clinic bills and gave his parents the signing bonus. They didn't have to do that. That's how nice they were. But see, it's these rules that are horribly written and horribly administered by Major League Baseball and its teams that allowed a young kid like Yuri to die when they could have clearly handled it better. And that is why so many point to the current problems in Dominican amateur baseball as a systemic crisis.
I mean, if all the apples are bad, maybe it's the tree that's the problem.
Something positive that did come out of the whole Yuri tragedy is that according to Rafael Perez, the head of Dominican operations, it raised teams' awareness. For example, the WAPO reports that every player living in a Dominican training facility is now offered a vaccination. And to my knowledge, no kid has died at an academy ever since, so... Yay! To close out the Yuri case, this is what Johnny DePuglia, the Nats scouting director, said about the settlement deal with his parents. We pushed it through. I think they, the Nats owners, did the right thing. The humane thing. Bruh. I think the humane thing would have been to not let the freaking kid die, but then again, what do I know? I don't run a baseball sweatshop, just a YouTube channel. Speaking of YouTube, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you all to please like, comment, and subscribe, because a lot of you guys watching don't subscribe, and like, hey, that's not cool. Come on, guys. Be cool.
We're gonna be cool.
Ho, 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 it's magic, you know.
You remember those dark ages when Major League Baseball was in a lockout? I know, how could you forget? Well, you may recall that one of the main sticking points towards the end of negotiations was dropping the qualifying offer for free agents in favor of instituting an international draft. Of course, once they found out about this, the players were outraged.
Outrageous.
Max Scherzer claimed MLB was muddying the waters. Francisco Lindor wanted you to get informed. And Fernando Tatis Jr. was talking murder. Something had to be done. So MLB and the MLBPA agreed to postpone talks of an international draft in order to get the 2022 to 2026 CBA signed. and they would decide on the fate of an international draft by a July 25th deadline. Great! So we had a new CBA, we had baseball back, and all of a sudden, all was right with the world.
69
Python.
But you may be asking yourself, does MLB actually want to change any of this?
I don't.
What has it done to improve its current system? And why are so many players opposed to an international draft? Well, remember that Eddie Dominguez guy who wrote that book because he wanted to shed a light on MLB corruption and totally didn't do it for financial reasons?
I like money.
When Dominguez followed up on a tip involving Cuban smugglers, one Robbie D. Manfred called up Dominguez and shouted,
Dominguez, what the fuck do you think you're doing?
Dominguez responded with following up on a tip.
Don't get fucking cute with me, Dominguez. Stop whatever it is you're doing. Is that clear? Stay down.
However this conversation went down, it's clear that Major League Baseball didn't want to get too involved in this, much like a lot of other cases, probably for the sole reason that once they started investigating, it'd kind of be a point of no return. And it's very unlikely that MLB is currently properly equipped to handle all the blowback that would come with such an investigation. And so when Fernando Tatis Jr. says an international draft will kill baseball in the Dominican Republic, he's doing exactly what Robbie Manfred's doing when he says the draft will fix the
vast majority of problems in the Dominican Republic.
These are blanket statements, and quite honestly, elitist attitudes, and are clearly pushing forth their own agendas and are way out of touch with an issue that is much, much more complex. An issue that thus deserves a much more nuanced approach. And perhaps another video? Well, you let me know down in the comments. Look, anyone who thinks that a draft will magically fix all the corruption in Latin America and in baseball in general is delusional.
You're completely delusional. I am? Sure.
In my opinion. I hope that today's video helps show you that such corruption is much more than just a couple of bad hombres. Like almost anything else, the underlying root causes of it run much deeper. And even though MLB refuses to admit it, this situation has spiraled out of control, in part because baseball has not been willing to enforce its own rules. They can say whatever they want about the draft being a silver bullet, but at the end of the day, if the rules of the draft aren't enforced, it's going to keep being a breeding ground for corruption, and it's going to be the exact same thing all over again. Except now, it's going to have a fancy name attached to it.
Now that's fancy!
If Major League Baseball truly wants this draft, well then guess what? It's going to make it happen. That's just the reality of that situation. All we can truly hope is that it is indeed a conversation between all parties involved, as MLB has suggested is the case, and that those conversations involve not only league officials and player representatives, but team officials in the DR, Buscones, Latinos actively involved in the game internationally, and you know what? The kids too. Because at the end of the day, neither the league nor the players union are the ones directly affected by these decisions.
Yo tengo que ser pelotero y que mi familia tenga mucho cuarto y que sean muy buenos conmigo. Si yo no lo teniera, nunca me amarían y me querían. Nunca.